Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. The process of voting is the absolutely essential foundation of our democracy. But that foundation has been under very serious and sustained attack by Russia and, incredibly, right here at home, by America's very own Republican Party. Why are so many so intent on subverting free and fair elections in the United States of America? And, more important, what can we do about it? I'll ask my guest, an expert on voting rights and the administration of elections. She's Myrna Pérez, Deputy Director of the Brennan Center's Democracy Program and the head of the Center's Voting Rights and Elections Project. Welcome. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So let's take a look at what's happening with voting, sort of an overall view to start with. And let's start with the good news first, because there is some good news. There's organizing going on and voter registration drives and what have you. So what's the positive take on voting right now?
There's a lot of things to be excited about. One you alluded to, which is the increased interest in participating. We have a lot of people who are trying to be involved in our democratic process and looking for a constructive way to engage. Some of them are hosting marches, some of them are volunteering for candidates, and some of them are actually going out and registering voters. The other thing that's exciting is that folks are paying attention to the administration of our elections. And you can see this in some of the reforms that we see. For example, Washington State just passed legislation on election day registration and on pre-registration, which would allow people who are not 18 but going to the DMV to register presumptively, and then when they turn of age, they're going to automatically be on the rolls. Right. We also have this really big reform called automatic voter registration, which is getting a lot of popularity. Let me explain for your audience what that is. In most circumstances, when a person goes to a government agency, they have to give information like their name, their address, their date of birth, whether or not they're a citizen. And if that agency is following federal law, and sometimes they're not, they ask if you want to register to vote. And if you say yes, in way too many instances, they ask again, okay, what is your name, your address, your date of birth? And there's no need for that. That information,
right?
Yeah, that information is already in the databases. We need to get the databases to talk to each other. So automatic voter registration does two things. It, one, has the information electronically sent over, so you don't have to deal with the mess of pen and paper and somebody trying to decipher somebody's chicken scratch and some poor clerk right before the election having to hand enter everything in. The second thing that it does is it changes the way we ask people to participate. It actually presumes that people want to register to vote. Right. And it puts them on the rolls, and then unless they say, no, thank you, I don't want to register to vote. Political scientists or behavioral scientists will call this an opt-out system as opposed to an opt-in system.
Right.
But those things really change behavior. We've seen it in insurance, we've seen it in organ donation. So automatic voter registration are those two things, the electronic transfer of the information and changing from an opt-in system, which is our status quo for the most part, to an opt-out system. And for a long time, automatic voter registration was just this idea that reformers had, and then it passed in Oregon, and then it passed in California, and now we have it in a number of states. It passed in DC, it passed in Illinois, I could go on and on and on. And there's still a lot of interest around this in the legislatures. We're seeing a lot of bills introduced across the country that would enact automatic voter registration in the state. And people like that reform because it is cheaper, because you take less paper. Right. It is more efficient because it doesn't require multiple steps. And it makes our rolls cleaner because you don't have people mistyping things because the computer is talking to another. So it's a good reform, and I think it's getting a lot of bipartisan support. It passed in Illinois with bipartisan support. Passed in West Virginia and in Vermont with bipartisan support. And in a time where there's so much like partisan rancor, it's nice to see that there's something that appeals to people on both sides of the aisle.
I agree. So we have some advances going on, but there are still problems. So what do you think are some of the biggest challenges faced by people who are trying to get more and more people to vote?
Okay, well, one of them is something that automatic voter registration would fix, which is just like a complicated registration system. You have to know well in advance that you want to participate and register. You have to understand the rules. If you move, you have to make sure that you get back on. The other is straight up politicians trying to manipulate the rules of the game so that some people can participate and some people can't. We are still seeing legislators introduce bills that would make it harder for people to vote. We can see them in the form of strict photo ID laws, people requiring documentation that proves your citizenship just to register to vote. We see people trying to cut back on early voting days. Those things I think are really problematic. The other thing that is more inchoate, but something that policymakers need to address and the public needs to be concerned about, is what I would call the voter fraud propaganda machine, which is just basically people that have a lot of power, a lot of influence, can get in front of a lot of cameras, undermining our elections and imposing fear into people that there are people that shouldn't be participating that are. And that minimizes faith in our elections. It disincentivizes people to participate. It also gives people a really bad taste in their mouth about the politicians, because the studies are pretty clear that that election fraud and voter fraud is very, very rare. So when they see politicians, peddling these myths, they turn out and they turn off.
So this has been an obsession, it seems to me, for the longest time among Republicans, among conservatives. Why this obsession with voter fraud when essentially, as you just pointed out, there is hardly any voter fraud that we can find among the millions and millions of people who go to the polls?
Well, one, I do think it undermines faith in the elections and makes it so that people just get sort of disgusted with the process and that they don't have enough faith in it. They don't think it'll have enough of an impact. So
but why do they want to undermine faith in voting?
Well, I think because there are some politicians that think that they're better off when certain segments of the population don't vote.
Right.
I think, it's craven political interests. It's, intentional discrimination. It's, a belief that our democracy doesn't function best when all of its voices are represented.
Right.
And I think it's really, really damaging, one, because it doesn't allow us to actually focus on the real problems that we have, that we should be trying to address. Two, it just makes people just not want to participate at all. And three, it masks motives and incentives and tarnishes what I think is a very American ideal, that we want everybody participating, that our democracy is most robust when we hear from all of its voices, and sometimes people are going to vote for people that don't win, and sometimes people are going to be upset because they're the loser, but they understand that that's how we as a country resolve our political differences. And when faith in that is not robust, then we have people that are very disenchanted and very disillusioned and feel like the country isn't meeting their needs and isn't representing them.
Right, and the fact that that's the way we decide on leadership and how we're going to go ahead, when you look at all of history, that's a pretty remarkable situation. It's a remarkable advance on history and needs to be protected. I think a lot of people don't understand how important this voting and democratic process that we've established really is.
The great civil rights historian Taylor Branch said that the vote was a little piece of nonviolence. It is the way we resolve our political differences. Other countries, use military coups, right? We don't do that.
Right, exactly.
And and if we want that to be meaningful, and if we want people to accept the outcome, and if we want people to trust that our leaders are doing what's best for the country, we need to have a democratic system that is free, fair, and accessible.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the Brennan Center and about the voting program, which you are the head of.
Sure. So the Brennan Center is named after the great Justice William Brennan, the Supreme Court justice that made famous the idea of a living constitution.
One of my heroes.
One of a lot of people's heroes. Our mission is to try and provide solutions to some of the very vexing problems of today. And one of the things that I like best about working at the Brennan Center is that we have a interdisciplinary model for doing our work. So one, we do in-depth, cutting-edge, research where we are trying to find original data and come up with original conclusions that allow us to dig deep in a particular problem. Another thing that we do is litigation. I spend a lot of time suing folks who are not making good our promise of having a discrimination-free election system.
Right.
We also do a lot of non-litigation advocacy, so we try to get a lot of legislation passed in a bunch of different places, and then we do a lot of communications because, there was once a time where civil rights lawyers had to go to church basements in order to reach the public, and we still spend a lot of time doing that. But when we're able to talk to the media, we're able to communicate to a large number of people under a various number of platforms to try and engage people on really important issues. And I think the communication and the public discussion around voting is what has contributed to the fact that a lot of people are really involved now. In our voting program, we tend to both try and fight voter suppression and try to make sure that we have good reforms that are happening, because we're never going to advance if all we're doing is preventing a rollback.
One of the vexing problems that continues to plague us is gerrymandering, or extreme gerrymandering. I mean, gerrymandering has been around forever. But extreme gerrymandering, and it's been used to unfairly, let's put it that way. So a lot of folks ask me, well, why don't we just throw gerrymandering out and use a computer and draw district lines? And in a conversation with you, you made it clear to me that is
it's one of my favorite questions.
Not such a simple process.
No.
So why can't you just take a computer and draw the lines?
That's one of my favorite questions, because I think that is a very common answer. And unfortunately, it's not that simple, because computers cannot account for the very human factor that is redistricting, in that we live in communities. And the purpose of representation is to make sure that communities have that representation. The purpose of districts is to make sure that we have some community representation. So a computer won't know when it's drawing their squares and the circles, where they're running through a particular neighborhood.
Right.
Or if a county doesn't have perfect lines and they're not a perfect square or they're not a perfect circle, how are you going to build a larger district that incorporates them? Computers can't tell whether or not there are particular ethnic enclaves that have been used to binding together. And computers can't tell when you have communities that have formed around, say, for example, a particular transportation line.
Right.
And so, we certainly must and should be in a position where we're not letting politicians use the redistricting process to draw themselves a 10-year job security plan. But, as long as our neighborhoods are not perfect, squares and circles, as long as our state boundaries aren't perfect squares and circles, as long as our counties aren't perfect squares and circles, we're not going to be able to have districts that are perfect squares and circles.
So we do need the human element when we're drawing district lines.
Yeah, I mean, redistricting is a process that requires a lot of different factors that need to be considered, and there's no one way to optimize them, right? I mean, like if you, we need them to all be to have equal population, but you have to balance population, and then you have to deal with the fact that communities are formed in certain ways. You have to deal with regional and local boundaries. You have to deal with geographic boundaries. And when you start putting in all these inputs, it stops looking like a square and it stops looking like a circle.
The Supreme Court back in 2013 essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was, in my view,
pretty hard.
the most important piece of federal legislation in my lifetime, but it's been gutted by the Supreme Court. So 5 years have gone by. Can we tell what the major effects of that ruling have been so far?
We've seen some of them. I mean, one, we've seen some states try to take advantage of the fact that we didn't have the Voting Rights Act federal protections to try and enact stricter laws. So for example, the one that keeps coming to mind is North Carolina, where someone said on tape, you know, when we had the Voting Rights Act in full force, we were just going to give a photo ID bill. But now that it's not there, we're going to go with the full bill. You know, I mean, that's not a direct quote, but you had people thinking like that. You know, we had states that had passed really strict proof of citizenship laws that kind of held them in abeyance. And then as soon as the Supreme Court decision came down, you know, went forward. And, you know, I myself have been litigating the Texas photo ID case for a really long time. The first time I won that case, I was on maternity leave, and now my kid is in kindergarten.
Oh my goodness.
Right, and, you know, it's something that the provision that was enfeebled by the Supreme Court dealt with pretty expeditiously. It had a process, it was quick, and now we're in this like protracted, what seemingly never-ending legal battle. And so we're seeing that in addition to things that are a little bit harder to pinpoint, we have less monitoring, less observers out there, less federal observers. People don't have to be informing the Department of Justice anymore when they're making changes, which was also a deterrent effect. So there's been a lot of pernicious effects about it, and I think it's really unfortunate because this country has made a promise to people that when they step into the ballot box, they're going to be free from racial discrimination. And the Voting Rights Act was a very tangible way of enforcing that promise. And with it being enfeebled, you know, we have one fewer tool.
So we're talking about democracy and elections and the importance of everything sort of involved there. And yet the United States has a pretty poor track record in terms of voter turnout in elections, and especially in non-presidential election years. Why is there so little interest in voting? I'm not saying that there is not a great deal of interest, but why isn't there more interest in voting? Why is turnout so often so low?
So I'm just going to push a little bit back on the question in that you phrased it in terms of interest. When I speak to folks, a lot of them are very interested in voting. There are barriers that make it harder for some people to vote. You know, one of the things that I'm thinking about is our state laws disenfranchising people with criminal convictions. Your viewers may be surprised to know that there are 4.5 million Americans who are living and working in our communities who cannot vote because of a criminal conviction in their past. Right. And when I speak to those folks, they want to vote, but that's a barrier. You also have an election system that is like devastatingly under-resourced. Like, we are the best democracy in the world, but we don't want to pay for our elections. And if we want to have a top-flight democracy, we need to be able to invest in it. So election administrators don't have the kind of resources they need to do public education about when elections are about to happen, what are the sort of issues on the ballot, how do people get answers if they don't understand it. We don't have enough poll workers that speak the appropriate languages so that our citizens who may be limited English are able to participate. You know, people don't have faith or trust in our voting machines because they're really, really old. You have all of these things compounding a problem, and we've seen that voting has a lot of what the data scientists will call sensitivity. All these little barriers become very cumulative and will disincentivize folks. So, you know, states that don't give people the ability to get time off of work in order to vote, that's going to put a barrier for some of them. States that don't have early voting, that's going to be a barrier for others. States that, you know, keep their polling or close their polling locations at 8 instead of 9, that's going to be a barrier for some. And so when you put these all together and couple with the fact that Americans are, you know, busier, have more jobs, sleep less, spend less time with our kids, spend less time in our churches, spend less time in our communities than before. It just leads to things being sacrificed, and one of them is voting, because people are having to make very real-world decisions about how to spend their time.
One of the things that has been a bit of a surprise recently has been there's been all these efforts to make it more difficult to vote. There's been clear efforts at voter suppression, and yet black turnout has been up recently, and not just in presidential elections. Can you explain that?
Okay, yeah, this is a really important topic because there are sometimes people who say, oh, we passed this voter suppressive legislation and all you people like the Brennan Center kept saying this was going to be a disaster, and look, black turnout went up. We need to remember that when you take averages from really large numbers, that's going to wash out individual effects. So it can both be true that overall black turnout increased, and there were segments of the black population that could not vote.
Right.
And some of the black population that could vote were really mad at seeing other people suppressed, so they made it a point of doing that. But you can't just look at overall turnout numbers and say, oh, that voter suppression didn't happen, because they're targeted for different kind of people. The voter suppression targets the folks that are on the margins, that are really susceptible to incremental barriers. The super voters are gonna go anyway. Like, I have the kind of job that allows me to come in late so that I can early vote if I need to, so I can work on election day, right? The people that aren't that lucky are going to be the ones that are deterred, and the people that can vote will turn out. So we just need to be really, really careful about not letting the turnout numbers wash out the individual effects and make it look like the suppression didn't actually happen.
How safe are our voting systems, our voting machines? And what I have in mind is, on the one hand, there's all the talk about the Russian hacking and efforts, and it's expected that the Russians are going to try and interfere in the off-year elections in 2018. But beyond that, so many systems are computerized, which is a good thing. But on the other hand, if something gets fouled up, is there a paper trail so that you can, count the votes that have been cast accurately? So overall, how safe are our voting systems, and is there work that we still need to be doing?
We definitely need to invest more in the security of our elections. We know that foreign criminals have been trying to interfere. We know that they were trying to access some of our voter registration databases. We know that they were trying to engage in disruptive social media. And we need to be in a position where we have confidence in our system so that that's not happening. We also know that many, many states have voting machines that are past their lifetime. The question there is both an issue of, are they subject to manipulation, but also, are they just going to make mistakes? Like some voting machines that people in this country, vote on involve like pressing buttons, but if the machine is really old, the calibration isn't going to work perfectly. So we need to be in a position where our systems are as state-of-the-art as we can, that we have the best technologists working with election administrators to make sure that our systems are as secure as they can be, but at the same time have methods for being able to audit and check that. We don't want all of our elections to be done with a black box. We want people to be able to have some sort of transparency in it that protects important things like an anonymous ballot, but strikes the right balance. And so some of the things that we can do is make sure that all of our voting machines provide a verifiable paper record. We need to make sure that we actually audit those things when necessary. We need to have plans for people to do threat analysis. So before the election, figure out where our vulnerabilities are and how we're going to troubleshoot it, how we're going to troubleshoot problems when we have them. And we need to have contingency plans on election day for how we're going to make sure that voters are able to vote if something goes wrong.
Right. We are going to have to stop there. Thank you so much.
I hope you'll invite me back again. This has been super fun.
I'll be happy to. The time goes so fast. Thank you very much. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. The endless debate over how to deal with gun violence, a perpetual feature of American life, is depressing in its absurdity. Some of the arguments are downright demented, like arming teachers in public school classrooms and allowing Americans to carry concealed weapons everywhere, in every state, no matter what the local gun laws have to say. Other arguments are pathetically inadequate, like outlawing bump stocks and tinkering with background checks. Even the proposals to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill, which sound so reasonable, are virtually unenforceable, not to mention the fact that most people suffering from mental illness are not violent and whenever they do pose a danger, it is mostly to themselves. Given the enormity of the problem, the staggering number of Americans killed each year by guns, these stopgap suggestions are ludicrously inadequate. This year will mark the 50th anniversary of the assassinations of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert Kennedy. Since their deaths in 1968, nearly 1.2 million people, men, women, and children, have been killed in America by guns in homicides, suicides, and accidents. 1.2 million. That's nearly 3 times the total number of Americans killed in all of World War II. This country is awash in oceans of blood from gun violence. All the chatter we're hearing about guns today will do nothing to substantially reduce the more than 30,000 people who will be killed by guns in America this year, and again next year, and the year after that. If we want to make a real difference, we have to stop the maniacal spread of new guns throughout our society and begin to drastically reduce the number of guns that are out there now. And we have to stop manufacturing so many guns. We also need to completely overhaul our violence-adoring culture. Our ultimate goal should be a wholesale reduction in the number of people who think that the answer to their problems and their biases and their discontent is a well-placed bullet. Short of that, all the talk we'll hear is gibberish. That's all for now. See you next time.